Welcome now to Grande Outdoors. This is Kyle Jackson. Rodney Wood couldn't be here today, but we've got a special guest, my brother Ty Jackson. Say hello.
How's it going?
We are going to talk about some trapping today. Ty and I have spent this morning and a little bit this afternoon prepping traps, and I kind of wanted to do a podcast on this because I think it's a fairly underappreciated, underused outdoor activity. I think there's a lot of stigmatism attached to it. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about trapping, and I think I just like it, so I wanted to talk about it. And Ty is one of the best trappers I know. I know there's a lot of good trappers out there, but he's got a lot of knowledge. He's read up on the subject, and so welcome to you.
Thanks.
So Ty, earlier this morning we spent some time prepping these traps. I guess let's start by talking a little bit about the history of trapping. Here in America, it's pretty dadgum, a pretty prominent part of our history.
Yep, definitely. It's the trapping is what opened up most of the U.S. To settlement and everything else. The trappers were the first ones in. They were the trailblazers. They were often the ones that were the scouts for the army, and so yeah, a lot of history. A lot of history,
and like you said, more often than not, they're known as the Mountainmen.
Yep.
And I guess that name still kind of holds true. We talked about a little earlier on a video that we did that trapping's one of those deals where you actually spend quite a bit more time out and about in the outdoors and in the mountains than a lot of times with hunting.
Yep. Yeah. You think about most folks spend, well, here in New Mexico, a week to a couple of weeks at the most, usually hunting every fall. And if you trap, you've got to be out in the woods every day that you got traps set. You got to be checking your traps, and so it's pretty easy to spend every day, or at least part of every day, for 3-4 months outdoors. Seeing what's going on outside. You really, trappers, it takes to be a decent trapper. You've got to be able to pay attention to what's going on around you. You got to be able to see the sign and know the animals that you're after. I bow hunt, and trapping is even harder than bow hunting. I think it's just one of those things that to get good at it, you really have to know the animals. You have to know their habitat and know their habits.
So let's talk about that real quick, because a lot of them, I said we want to talk about some of the misconceptions and the misinformation out there about trapping. One of the big ones, I think, and you and I have dealt with this quite a bit with the Officers Association that we're involved with, fighting against legislation that is anti-trapping here in New Mexico. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there and misinformation spun by the anti-hunter trapper groups out there is that trapping is extremely indiscriminate.
Right.
And that's just not true.
That's definitely not true. The perception that trapping hasn't changed in the last 200 years is definitely not true. It's not accurate. You look at the equipment that we use, and while it looks on its face, it looks fairly similar. There's been a huge amount of advancement made in the equipment that we use, in the techniques, and all of that has helped with both taking care of the animal that we do end up trapping in a better way. You're using better traps, more humane traps, and also just the laws. A lot of people think that there's just no laws that apply to trapping, and that's not true either. This isn't 1820. This is 2018, and there's a lot of laws. New Mexico's got a highly regulated trapping season, and so all of the things you have to follow, it's all designed to help, first of all, to prevent over harvest of the animal, but also that the animals are taken in a humane way, the same as any hunting, or anything else, fishing or anything else. All the changes are similar.
And I'll pick your brain a little bit about this because you've done trapping a lot more. I've kind of dabbled in trapping here and there. You know, it's not terribly cheap to get into, but once
Yep.
you get into it, it's actually a good way to make some extra money. But like I said, I'll kind of lean on you for this. But the regulation, the laws that kind of restrict trappers are almost more stringent, and you have more selectability within how you can do it legally than the hunting laws.
Yep.
It seems like, just because not only does every trap have to be marked, it has to have the correct jaw size, it has to have, you know, all these different you know, stipulations on
Yep.
how to do it.
You know, you think about if every piece of your equipment when you were hunting had to be marked and otherwise it was illegal, that would, you know, that'd be a lot of work for a hunter, and that's what the trappers have to do. You got to have everything marked. You have
It's
to
got to have either a trapper ID number or
well, it regardless of what you call it, a trapper ID number or your customer identification number. Either one, they're both basically the same thing. Two different terms for the same thing here in New Mexico. So anytime you get an account with New Mexico Game and Fish, to buy any sort of license, you got to have an account. And once you get that account, you get a unique customer identification number is what it's called.
right.
And that works as your trapper identification. Some of the older folks that have been around, that have been trappers in New Mexico for a while, have a different number that's called, was specifically called a trapper identification number, or trap ID number. And that was prior to us having, you know, a computerized online system for accounts. That was prior to customer identification numbers.
And so that's kind of another example of how this is always progressing, always
Yep.
moving forward, because excuse me, because I remember, you know, they had to have that trapper ID number, or you had to have your name, address, all that stuff
Right,
on that tag.
right.
And so, again, a good example of how this industry is absolutely not stagnant, and the same as it was back in the Mountainmen days. It is moving forward and trying to make it easier for people to get out there and do stuff.
Yeah, and I mean it's advanced even more rapidly than maybe it has in the past. You know, we're talking about the Mountainmen days, but even from when I was a kid, the advancements that have been made in trap design in order to reduce any injury to the animals that you catch is just phenomenal. I mean, you look at one of these traps that we have right here, this an MB 550. It's one of the most advanced traps ever. I mean, it's one of the latest and greatest. It's probably been out on the market for, you know, somewhere around 6 years or something like that, 7 years. It's a trap that, you know, it just comes out of the box ready to go for someone to use. It's not a cheap trap, but it is a trap that, you know, if you catch an animal in it, it's going to hold that animal, but it's also not going to injure that animal. So if you decide when you get there that's not an animal that you want to take for whatever reason, you know, sometimes you turn stuff loose because it's not the species you're after, or it's not big enough, or it's not prime, or something like that. You want to turn it loose. That's a trap that you can catch them when you show up. You can release them, and there's not going to be any permanent injury because of that, just because of the way that the trap is designed. You know, you look at the traps that even back in the 70s and 80s, and some of those had some pretty significant advancements over previous traps, but these are light years ahead of those traps. They just are quality product that will take care of the animal, and if you take care of the equipment, it'll take care of you forever. I mean, this is a piece of equipment that I can probably hand down to my kids at some point if I take care of this trap. You know, it's going to be good forever, other than replacing maybe some springs.
So those of you out there in listening world, we're going to have also, I'm trying to videotape this podcast, and I hope it works, but at some point we'll have some videos on our YouTube channel at Grande Outdoors, And I'm going to have Ty just kind of take us through the nomenclature of this trap, this MB550, and kind of tell us why that's such a, advanced trap and the differences between that and some of the old traps.
So a lot of people, when they hear trap, they think in their mind the old traps with teeth and
the old bear
trap
you
type. Yeah,
you
exactly.
see in the cartoons and all that stuff.
Yep.
And while they did have those,
Yep.
Do you have one hanging out in your shop?
I've got
a similar.
I've got one that's similar. I don't actually have any bear traps, and they did those were used, but those are not legal in New Mexico anymore. They haven't been legal for about 40 years now.
They're probably not legal in most of the United States.
They're not legal in any state in the United States, and they haven't been for quite a while.
Yeah.
So, you look at this trap here, and I realize not everyone can see this, but if you Google just a MB 550, Minnesota brand 550, you can kind of see what we're looking at. But this is a coil spring type trap. It doesn't have the big long springs like the other type of trap does, but it comes with quite a few things that are very advantageous for taking care of the animal when you do catch it, and then making sure that it's still there so that you don't show up and have a fired trap with nothing in it. Obviously that's not what you want either. So a couple things. It's got nice levers here. It's got relatively short top on the lever, which helps it fire through the ground. It's got good strong springs on it, and what you don't want a trap that's got really weak springs. You don't need it super strong, and these aren't super strong. I mean, you can put your hand in it, you can fire it on your hand. It's not going to break your hand, it's not going to break your fingers, anything like that. I've caught myself, my boys have caught themselves.
Yeah, your boys trap with you, and they've caught themselves numerous times.
Yep.
You caught your dog. You almost.
I've caught all of my dogs.
Yeah.
A couple of them I've caught a couple times, but it's not gonna hurt them. It's like anything else. If you put your hand in it, it's gonna surprise you, and that's more than anything. What happens is you get surprised. It stings, but it doesn't leave any permanent damage. It doesn't break bones. It doesn't break the skin. Nothing like that. But a couple of the things that are really, well, I guess I'll go back to why you want strong springs. You don't want springs that are so powerful that they end up breaking bones or something like that, because that's not to your advantage as a trapper, and it's also not something that you want as a humane method of taking animals. But you don't want something that's really weak, and the reason you don't, and it's a little bit counterintuitive, but the reason you don't want something that's too weak, if the springs are too weak, it allows an animal that's caught in this for their foot to slide back and forth in this trap. And what that will do, in this trap it'd be a little bit tougher to do, but it's possible in any trap. But what you end up doing is, if you think about they're going back and forth, it's just an abrasion against that skin, and it can end up causing a cut.
Well, think about any old movie where something is tied up and they find something to rub it on.
Right, exactly.
You're going to have the same effect where it's going to cause some sort of friction abrasion on that area.
Even though it's not sharp, you look at the inside of this jaw, it's rounded. This has got what they call cast jaws, so they're thicker jaws, and it's rounded on the edges. There's no sharp edge anywhere here, but just going back and forth will cause that cutting. If you have a strong spring like these have, what it will do is it will hold that foot in one position, and that will end up with an animal that when you show up and you decide to release it, it's got a dent basically in the fur right there, but no cut, no broken bone, no damage whatsoever. So again, having decent, good, strong springs is a benefit. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but it is a benefit to animal welfare. The second thing is, like I said, the jaws. You look at these jaws, and these are what they call cast jaws, so that has a good wide face on it. And if you think about why you would want a wider face on it, you just think of a ruler. Take like your school from grade school, your ruler, your 12-inch ruler, and if you take the widest portion of that and you push it two of those rulers, and you put your hand in between them and you kind of squeeze it, versus taking the narrow edge of that ruler and squeezing it together, if that makes sense. It's just more
Well, yeah,
surface area.
the smaller surface area is going to create more pressure
Right.
per square inch
Exactly.
than the wide surface, and so that's why those wide jaws are really nice. Also, why, and we'll get into the offset here in a little bit, but also why the lamination of the jaws is important if you don't have an offset.
Right. So if you don't have an offset, you can, or if you don't have a cast jaw, you can create the same thing on any trap by adding what they call lamination, which is just a piece of round rod or something, or a flat stock or something that's welded to the top of the jaw or the inside of the jaw or both, and it just increases your surface area. So you just have a wider area pushing or holding on that animal's foot. And so another advantage to these traps, or another advancement in these traps, and this isn't really new, but these have been around for a while, but is the offset. So it's basically when the trap is fully closed, there's a gap in between the jaws.
So if you're watching this on the video, and we'll kind of put these up side to side, and if you look at the top of the jaw on the right here, the one that I'm holding is not offset, and those jaws are flush together. There's no space between them. You can't see anything. And then the jaws that Ty's talking about is offset, which means it's got a gap in there. I don't know, what is that, a 1/4 inch gap? Or
It's probably, it's close to a 1/4 inch.
anyways, it's close to 1/4 inch. So there's a gap that you can see in between the jaws on the top where the foot would be held, the animal foot would be held, and then they come together along the sides. So that's what he's talking about in the offset.
And so in New Mexico, any trap that's got an inside jaw spread of 5.5 inches or larger has got to be offset. And that offset has to be at least 3/16 of an inch, which this obviously is more than that. But again, this is a benefit, and it does a couple things. First of all, it allows a little bit of blood flow to go to that foot when you do catch an animal, so you're not cutting off all of the blood flow. And it also allows these levers to go just a little bit higher, and that will prevent an animal from escaping or from pulling out of the trap, is what they call it.
So we talked about that a little bit on the other video that we did, but if you look at this non-offset, and if an animal foot was in there, these jaws are going to have, or the levers are going to be a little bit further down to allow for that animal's foot to be in there, versus how high up these are with the offset. And tell us a little bit about why that's an advantage on that offset.
So other than, obviously the springs are what hold those levers up, but primarily what's holding the animal in a trap is not necessarily just spring pressure alone. It's the mechanical advantage of having these levers as high up on the jaws as possible. The higher the better. When they're all the way up, it's fully locked up, and there's really almost no way, if you took a screwdriver and tried to pry these apart, you'd bend the jaws before you'd get the levers to go down. But as the levers go down, the further down they are, the easier it is to get those jaws to pry apart.
And these ones are tough just because they've been just recently waxed.
Yes,
but
they're all closed up because we just got done waxing them. But so that's an advantage. That's an advancement that's happened since probably the mid '80s or so. The trappers, most of these advancements, trappers have come up with themselves. They weren't mandated by any state. They weren't put into law. Some of them are put into law now, but it was always after the fact. Trappers are really good about coming up with new and inventive ways of making these traps better.
well, because they're making money, so why not be as efficient as possible doing it? It's
Right.
just like any private business. If you're not innovating and doing new things and creating a more efficient way of doing it, you're not going to be in business very long.
Yeah,
So
and it's even some of it's some of the trappers definitely are trapping for money, but by and large, most trappers they make a little bit of money back, but I can pretty well guarantee they don't make enough back to pay for all their gas and everything. So they're doing it as for recreation, and because they enjoy the sport and because they want to be in the outdoors. And so a lot of these advancements are because they don't want obviously they don't want a trap that's going to hurt an animal. They don't want a trap that's going to cut a foot off or something like that. Like all of the perceptions that you hear, all of the urban legends or whatever about traps is, they're just going to cut everything's foot off, which really makes no sense from a logical perspective. If I as a trapper am interested in catching my animal, it has to be there when I show up. It doesn't do me any good just for the trap to cut a foot off. So if I had a trap that did that, I would pretty quickly find that that's not a trap I want to use, just from a logical standpoint, regardless of whether it's legal or not.
Well, I guess from the other standpoint, other than just making money, making things more efficient, is you talk about sweat equity and the amount of effort it took for those old traps, those long springs. I've you've used those, I've used those. These are far more easy to use, and so you talk about efficiency from a sweat equity standpoint. These advancements are fantastic.
Yep. So another advancement is kind of the center swivel here, and the reason for that being centered versus you look at this older trap. This trap is probably from the mid 80s or so. Again, it doesn't have the offset. It doesn't have several things. The levers don't quite come as high. It doesn't have a laminated jaw or anything. You've got a pretty narrow jaw when you look at it here. It's not sharp, but it's still narrow. But you can see that it's where the chain attaches to the frame of the trap is off of the corner here. And on these newer traps, this one as well, it comes off the center. And the reason for that is so that animal's foot isn't sliding when they hit the end of the chain. Obviously when they get trapped, they're going to go back and they're going to hit the end of the chain wherever it's staked off. And you don't want that foot sliding in there. And by having it center swiveled, it can rotate, and no matter where that animal's foot is in the trap, it's not going to cause it to slide around in there. And again, the sliding, like we talked about before, if it starts sliding back and forth, that can cause some abrasion, that can cause some cutting, and we want to avoid that. Another thing, you look at some of these old traps, and you'll notice that they rarely had more than one swivel, if they had any swivels at all in the chain. And these swivels are a huge benefit for animal welfare, for taking care of everything that you catch in these traps. And the reason for that is you don't want it to get bound up. So if you think about an animal getting caught in a trap and it starts to twist around or spin or try to get away or whatever, and it can bind that chain up to the point where some of those old traps could cause a broken leg or something like that. You won't find traps now that come from any manufacturer that don't have swivels.
So if you look here, if you're watching the video, or you can go kind of Google or YouTube any trapping video, but if you twist this chain that doesn't have a swivel in it, obviously the more you twist it, the more it's going to kink, the more it's going to bind, and at some point that's going to quit moving, and then that's going to create that point where that animal's likely going to break something or tear something or do something like that. And those swivels allow it. You've got multiple in this MB550. You've got at least 3 swivels on it, I see.
Yeah, I've got 3 swivels, which actually gives me 6 swivel points, because each swivel has 2 points that can move. And the more swivels, the better, within reason. But I wouldn't do less than 2 on any trap if I were setting them up myself. I like 3. 3 works pretty well on this one, just because in between here, you can see I've got a spring, a shock spring. And that shock spring is, again, another advancement here in the last probably 20 years, 15, 20 years, that trappers came up with, that helps reduce injury to any animal that you catch. And what this does is it's basically a shock absorber. So instead of it having a hard jerk when it hits the end of the chain, because again you're catching a wild animal, and so it's surprised and it's trying to get out of the trap, and it's trying to leave, and so when it's trying to leave, it's hitting the end of this. When it's hitting the end of this just basically just gives a cushion. So it's not just a hard jerk, it's more of a kind of a spring there right at the end. and it reduces, the goal of this is to reduce injury. It's to reduce foot injury and shoulder injury on anything that you catch.
But I would imagine additionally, it's rather than, or besides just reducing the injury, obviously if you don't have that hard jerk, you're going to have less animals get out of the trap.
Sure. Yeah. It helps. It helps from that point perspective. It also helps keep your anchoring system solid. If you're staked off or something like that, usually you're staking into the ground with a variety of different types of stakes, and not all ground is the same. Some ground is pretty hard and it'll hold a stake, and some of it's not so hard. You get into some sandy country or just some loose soil. It may be hard to keep a stake there, and this shock spring will kind of help keep that stake there. Because again, you don't want an ethical trapper, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the animal, the welfare of the animal. You don't want an animal leaving your trap site with a trap on its foot. That's not good for the animal. It's not good for you as a trapper. Not to mention it's expensive. You talk about losing this trap as it's set up here. This is almost $30 worth of equipment, not including your stake. So you wouldn't want to lose that. You definitely don't want the animal out there with this on it. You want to be able to either release that animal or harvest that animal. So all of this is we use this to improve trapping and to be more effective, more efficient, and also improve the welfare of those animals that we catch in case we do want to release them. I guess the final thing is just be the ring here at the end. These are just jumbo lap links, but there's several different things you can use for these. But I like these just from the perspective of often I will cross stake, and that is so that I don't lose a trap. I've never lost a trap, with an animal in it, and I don't want to ever lose one. I want that animal to be there when I show up so that I can either, like I say, release it or harvest it. These lap links here they're big enough they'll allow 2 stakes to go through here, or 1 stake if the ground is hard enough, but I'll usually use 2 stakes, and that will ensure that I keep that animal there.
And so for anybody out there who isn't familiar with trapping, if usually you're using a stake, there's some people, you've got some drags and things like that, but most of the time you're going to stake that trap in place so that whenever that animal gets caught, they don't go anywhere. You can find them and not have to look for them or anything like that. But the cross stake is where you use 2 stakes and you drive it in opposing directions.
Right.
That way, if you get a pretty good, if you get an animal who's pretty, vigorous, if you just have 1 stake, they can go round and round and kind of wallow that out, especially in soft ground.
Yep.
And that's cross staking allows you to keep that trap in place, because any direction that they pull on those stakes is going to have some opposing, keeping power.
Yep. So another thing, just for those of you that are in New Mexico, in particular the southwestern portion of New Mexico, we do have the Mexican gray wolves, and so as part of
and they're federally
they're an endangered species, a federally endangered species. They're also I believe they're a state endangered species, but if you're going to trap in that part of the state where there are wolves, you need to exercise what they call due care, and cross staking or anchoring it off solid via a variety of different ways, but cross staking is one of them. Is due care. Again, you don't want to cause any injury to that species if you do accidentally catch one in a coyote set or something like that. Usually, for those of you that don't know much about trapping, your sets, people think about traps as being pretty indiscriminate, but they can actually be very discriminate on the species caught, and maybe even the age of the species caught, depending on how you set it, where you set it, and how you have your trap set up. So, when it comes to things like a wolf, similar species use the country the same way, or similar ways. So a coyote and a wolf use the same travel corridors. They visit the same types of places.
So basically, when you're setting a trap, if you're going to set a trap for a coyote in wolf country, them being canine species, not just canine species, but fairly closely related canine species, those places where you would set a trap for a coyote are likely going to be places that a wolf would also use because they use terrain and look for food in similar ways.
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. The wolf population in the state right now isn't terribly high, so the odds of you catching one just based on numbers is not very high. But if you do a few things, you can ensure that you're not going to be in any sort of trouble if you do end up catching a wolf, and you're also not going to cause any injury to that wolf. Both of those things should be kind of a paramount concern for you if you're trapping in that part of the state.
And so for most of this stuff, we're talking about those who are going to do it legally. Obviously, there's those who do it outside of the law, and we're not talking about that. Those guys most of the time don't know what they're doing. They're just out there for a quick buck. They're not in it for the conservation. They're not in it for the right reasons. And so again, what we're talking about is doing this legally. And you were talking about how species specific you can be.
Yep.
Walk us through what in this trap allows you to do that.
Well, so there's a bunch of different things that can allow you to be more species specific. And the first is where you decide to set that trap. Like I said just a minute ago, the place where I would make a coyote set is not the same place often. Usually it is not the same type of place where I would make a fox or definitely a bobcat type set. There's a few things when it comes to the traps themselves that you can make you much more specific, so that you're not catching things you don't want to be catching. I hear a lot of folks talk about they're catching every rabbit, or they've heard about someone who caught a bunch of rabbits in their traps, and there's no reason for you to be catching rabbits. If you do just a little bit of work in the preseason, you won't catch any non-targets. And one of the things that you can do is, first of all, buy a quality type of trap that will allow you to make some of these adjustments. If this 550 here, it does not have a screw that holds the pan, and most of these traps, most modern traps, have a screw right in here that will hold the pan, and you can either tighten it or loosen it based on the species that you're after. So if you think about what a coyote weighs versus what a fox weighs, for example, if the average New Mexico coyote weighs 20 pounds and the average gray fox in the state weighs, I don't know, 5 pounds maybe, that's a huge difference. And so by just tightening the pan to 4 to 5 pounds, I will catch all of my coyotes, but I will not, a fox will almost never be able to fire this trap.
And you can probably think about that pan tension, especially if you're a shooter. Think about that pan tension like the poundage on a trigger.
That's exactly how many pounds it takes before it moves. And just like in a good trigger, you don't want a lot of movement. You don't want a lot of creep in that. You want it, when it fires, you want it to be a short, quick movement, and it goes at that whatever that poundage is, and then that's where it breaks, and it'll fire the trap just like in your gun.
So what? Just because you mentioned it, we'll touch on it real quick. But if you've got that creep, generally what's going to happen if you've got that creep in that pan?
If you've got creep in your pan, it's not a good thing, because what you'll end up doing is you may end up spooking an animal. It can feel when it steps on it, and it feels a little soft, and they may not step on it long enough or hard enough for the trap to fire, or they start to feel it move and they come off of it, and you're going to miss animals. So you don't. That's not how you want to have them set up. You want to have them set up where most of my traps are night latched. This MB550 is it comes from the factory night latched, and they're I don't even know what that is. It's a tiny little amount of movement, but it shouldn't have, just like in your trigger, it shouldn't have any movement until it goes.
Yeah.
And when it goes, it should just be a short movement, and the trap will fire.
And so I don't know if you guys, if you're watching the video, I don't know if you can see it, but on this MB550, there's just a little groove right here at the end, very end of the what they call the dog, and that's where this goes under. This jaw is going to come down and go under this, so the pressure is pushing this dog upward. But then that pan, when you set it and it comes down, you can hear that click, and that's the night latch. That's what he's talking about when he says night latch. It's just sets that pan to the exactly where you need it, so it's going to be a smooth, crisp break, just like a trigger would. On this other bridger here, if you can kind of see the profile of it, it's got a little indentation on the backside. It's been punched. It's got a little rise there, and so the pan does the same thing. When that jaw comes down and creates pressure, it creates that night latch so that it's a nice smooth break.
So even though we've been talking about this 550 quite a bit, even though this 550 I can't, it doesn't have a screw or a bolt to tighten for my pan tension, just because the makers of this particular trap are they make some of the best traps available. They know what they're doing, and the way that they designed this trap, it actually comes with pan tension, even though there isn't a bolt or a screw there to tighten. And you can change it if you want to. You can bend basically the dog, which is this little piece that flips up that holds your jaw down. You can bend the dog either up or down, and it will change your pan tension either up or down depending on what you want to do. If you decided you wanted to, for whatever reason, four-coil it, which is put another set of coils on the other side here, it would automatically increase your pan tension by about double. So it would take it from it's somewhere around 3 pounds to up around 5-6 pounds.
And that's designed that way because the higher tension you get, probably the more jaw strength you're going to need to hold the animal that you're looking for.
Yep, potentially. And what I found is in New Mexico, as long as you're not dealing with really hard frozen ground type of conditions, 2 coils work pretty well most of the time. There's just not much true need for a 4-coil. Some traps come 4-coiled, and that's some traps that's the only way you can get them, and they're fine. I've got some of those. They're really nice traps, but it's not necessarily needed, and so that's an extra expense that maybe you don't want to spend, especially just getting started in trapping, because it is so expensive, because you have to have so much equipment.
So I'm glad you talked about that. I think I want to talk a little bit more about that, since if you never trapped before, what is a dozen of these traps cost? Kind of what are you looking at to get into trapping from the beginning, especially if you're trying to do it on your own. I thankfully have you as a resource that I can use to kind of bounce ideas off of. But if you're trying to get into it on your own, what are you looking at just to kind of get into it?
Well, it's not necessarily a cheap endeavor, but it will pay. I will say it'll pay just like anything. If you buy quality, you'll only cry once. So it depends on exactly what you're looking for, how serious you think you're going to be. I will say that this trap right here, which is this Bridger 1.75 or 1 3/4, it's kind of a square jaw. This is a nice little trap. It's offset, but it's not laminated. In New Mexico, this size trap doesn't need to be laminated. It doesn't even need to be offset, but I would recommend the offset. But that's a nice entry-level trap that will catch and hold all of our legal species pretty easily, and that trap is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 to $90 a dozen, depending on where and when you get them. You can get them on sale for about $80. I think normally they're about $90 a dozen.
So how many traps do you have personally?
I've got probably a couple hundred.
Okay. So, but you do a little bit of long line trapping in the fall, where you take a week off and you actually go and you trap and do things like that.
Yep.
For the everyday common guy, about how many traps would you recommend to start out with?
I would recommend just starting out with 1 dozen, maybe even just a half dozen, and see if you like it. If you like it, you can always get more. And you don't have to get the best in the whole world, but these traps are a nice trap that you can do just a little bit of work on, as far as, like tighten up your pan to the right tension, and you're pretty well ready to go. You boil and dye them and wax them, and you're ready to go. Maybe add a lap link to the end, and that's about it. Some of these other traps, this MD 550 is a really nice trap. This is probably one of the best traps out there, especially for coyotes. I really like it for coyotes. And it's a really well made trap. It will last you forever if you take care of it. But they're around $200 a dozen, so they're quite a bit more expensive. I've got some other traps that I use that are even more expensive than that. They're about almost $300 a dozen. But it just depends on where you're trapping, how much you're trapping, and really what you like. A lot of this stuff is personal preference. What I like may not be what you like, and that's okay. That's why they make different kinds of traps.
Yeah, for sure. And so, besides the trap, you're gonna want to get dye and wax. Let's talk about that real quick. Why do you need those?
So the dye is really what it does visually is it'll turn your traps black. And for those of you that are watching the video, you can see how these traps are nice and black. We just dyed them, just waxed them. If you look, I've got one this one has not been done yet, and you can just see it was done last year, but this after a year, or not a year, but after being in the ground for a few weeks over the fall and winter, in a few different places, it gets muddy, the wax gets worn off, it kind of gets a little bit shiny, it gets a little bit rusty, and so you want to take care of these. Again, if you take care of them, they'll last forever, for the most part, except for your springs, and those are easy to replace. They're cheap to replace. So your dye will turn it black or brown. If you use a speed dip or anything, you can get different colors, but most of them are going to be black. And that's really to keep it from being, keep it from rusting, to get rid of some of that rust. It also sort of acts as a little bit of camouflage, I guess, if your trap were to get uncovered for whatever reason. But that's basically what it does. And as you're dyeing it, you're boiling it, which is removing scent. You're getting rid of all the scent that's attached to this trap. It may have salt, it may have oil, it may have a little bit of grease, it may smell like you because you've been handling it with your hands. So it'll get rid of all of that. And then after you get done boiling and dyeing them, you're gonna wax them, or I like to wax my traps. Some guys don't like to do it. I do. I feel like it does a couple things for me. The first is that it really will preserve this trap. It'll keep it from getting rusty. You think about trapping in the fall and the winter. It's snowing, it's raining, the ground's wet, and you put one of these traps in the ground. It's a piece of metal. If you don't have that wax on there, it's going to take about 2-3 days before it's rusted.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work as well when it's rusted. The pan may not come down, the levers may not go up, the jaws may not want to close. So waxing will help preserve your metal. The second thing it does is it acts as just a little bit of lubricant. So it's not metal on metal when this trap is trying to close. And you want your traps to fire quickly. You don't want a slow or delayed fire, which can cause catches that are not ideal. You
instead
don't want
instead of the foot or catching the whole foot or all the pad, you catch a toe or something like that.
Yeah, you don't want to catch just a toe. You don't want to catch just a couple of toes. You want to be able to catch a full pad, which is basically right there at that heel pad, and so that lubrication will help it fire and quickly. So.
With the dyeing and waxing, it's going to take a little bit of time. This is one of those things where it's not a overnight deal. You got to spend some time prepping to do this.
Yeah.
I think the dyeing and waxing of how many traps?
Oh, we probably did a couple dozen.
So a couple dozen traps took us about 3 hours. Now it wouldn't take you any longer to do more traps. We just didn't have enough wax to kind of keep going. But it's the heating up of the barrel and the water to dye them that kind of took the longest amount of time. But well worth the effort. What does this do for you longevity wise? Just through the season, down the years?
Yeah, I mean, it basically, like I say, you don't ever want these getting so rusty that they're just not usable anymore. That they start falling apart, or you have such deep rust in them that they start flaking. The metal becomes structurally unsound. And by taking care of these traps, I usually just do my traps once a year. All my traps, I'll boil and dye them and wax them once a year, and that will get me by for a whole year. And the amount of dye it'll take, I use just a logwood dye. It's I don't even remember how much it is. It's cheap. It's like a couple of bucks for a pound bag of it. I may use 2 to 3 pounds of it. So a couple of packages, and then your wax. It's expensive to buy at first, but it lasts. You don't use very much of it. So once you have it, you can reuse it year after year as long as you don't burn it. And so a lot of this stuff, it's an expensive upfront investment, but later on, you don't, once you buy your traps, you don't have to buy them again. Once you buy wax, you will have to buy more wax at some point, but it'll last you quite a while. You buy 10 or 15 pounds of wax, it's going to last a long time. That will wax a lot of traps.
Yeah. So I want to talk about something I know you're pretty, you get pretty hot about. Colorado went away from these foothold traps, and they went to only the box traps, which people call live traps.
Right.
And the argument from those who see these fluffy, cute little animals getting caught is, oh, it's more humane to use those quote unquote live traps. What do you say to that?
It may or may not be. It just depends on the species. There's a few significant disadvantages to using a cage type trap. I don't like hearing cage traps called live traps, because all of these traps that we're talking about today, these foothold traps, they're all live traps. I mean, they're designed to catch and hold that animal until you get there, and they're not going to kill that animal.
And you can release it if it's a non-target species. In fact, in New Mexico, you are required to carry a catch pole or something that you can use to release non-target species.
Right. Yeah, it's illegal for you to trap without a device to release unwanted animals. But yeah, it's the cage trap. It's not. People think of it as being a more humane method of capture, and it is a humane method of capture, but it is not without its disadvantages. You can have animals in there that are fighting that cage so much that they end up hurting themselves. In particular, it seems like a lot of animals will want to bite that cage, and you'll end up with a broken tooth or something like that. So it's not a fail-safe. I don't usually see any damage to the animals when I catch them with a foothold. And a lot of times, even a cage, I won't see necessarily damage, but usually when I do see damage, it's usually to the head or mouth or face, where that animal has been rubbing against that cage, trying to get out, or it's been biting that cage and it's broken a tooth or something like that. So,
well, you talk about the technological advances in these foothold traps, where they've got this spring to lessen that I guess
the shock.
Yep.
That
of them hitting the end of that, where you really don't have that advantage in those box traps, because they can get full on and hit the end of the box trap, and then they go the other way as soon as you show up, and so you don't have some of that stuff. So yeah, that's interesting as well. So these are all live traps because they hold that animal.
Right.
Are there traps in or implements that you use in trapping that are not live traps?
Yeah, you can use a couple of different types of traps. So there's, any of the body gripping traps are, people commonly call them conibear traps, but that's a brand name. But those are killing type traps, and in New Mexico, really, except for the really small ones, you have to use those in water. Those are typically water type traps for beaver, muskrat, things like that. On land, about the only one that people will use is a snare, and snares are legal in New Mexico. Again, you have to use them carefully, because like anything, you know, you don't want to catch something, you know, a non-target in one of these, or
Well, this is where it comes back to, and we're going to spend some time with you in the field actually doing some trapping later on in the fall.
Yep.
But this is where knowing your animal, knowing its patterns, being able to set this will be the discriminating factor here.
Yes.
Because this will catch anything that walks through it.
It will, but there's even this is not necessarily, I won't say it's not indiscriminate, because you can catch anything in this, but there's some things on here that I built this snare myself, and there's some ways to build these where even if you catch something you don't necessarily want to catch, it doesn't end up in a bad situation. And so, for example, a lot of times, with snares in particular, you're setting those on trail type situations, you know, that the animal is walking down a trail and you're catching them. What you don't want to do is you don't want to end up with an elk or a deer foot snared in one of these, because obviously this is going to be set at the height of a predator, which is, you know, less than 2 feet off the ground. All of your deer and your elk, that's about knee high on all of those. So typically what we'll see is a deer or an elk would catch a foot, or cattle, or horses or livestock, any type of livestock, if they're using those trails, and they step in one of these, and it comes around their foot. This is a bad situation. Obviously, you don't want this. You don't want a deer or an elk hung up by the foot with your snare or cable restraint. So
those snares are designed so that they can close but not open, and so that's why it's not like this offset jaw where it still allows some blood flow. If that closes, and the more they fight against it, the tighter it gets. Right. And so it's designed so that it doesn't open.
Yep. So what you can do, and this isn't required in New Mexico, but I would definitely recommend anyone using snares or cable restraints in New Mexico, I would highly recommend that you use these. So you can see there's a little S hook right here, those of you that are watching this, and this S hook is what's called a breakaway, and it breaks away, I believe these are 285 pounds of pressure. So once an animal gets caught, if it hits the end of this snare with 285 pounds of pressure or more, it will open this S hook. That S hook will blow apart, and it will leave, that animal can leave the set, can leave that location with no part of the snare attached to them. So you're not going to end up with...
It's basically a safety mechanism.
Exactly. And so the reason 285 pounds is because most coyotes can't hit the end of these with more than that.
Right.
So again, where you set it, how you set it, that little safety device, you can also, this one doesn't have it, some of mine do, but they'll have a little nut put on here and just smashed flat, kind of like this ferrule is. You can see here it's just like that, only it'll be down here about 4 or 5 inches from the end on the lock side, and that's what's called a deer stop. And what it'll do is when it comes tight, it can't pass that point. Let's say that nut is right here. It can't pass that, so it can't tighten down past that point. And the reason again is so that won't tighten down around a deer's foot. And
obviously that's going to be small enough to hold a coyote.
Sure. And you can set these up. You know, a lot of people consider snares lethal, and snares typically are, but they're also what's called a cable restraint, which it basically is designed to catch and hold them like a leash, and it's not designed to kill them. So it depends on the lock that you're using. This one is a non-relaxing lock, but some of them have a relaxing lock, and so it will hold them, but it won't kill them. In New Mexico, some states require that they be cable restraint. Some don't. New Mexico is one of those that doesn't. We don't have a lot of folks that use snares, and I don't use snares very much, but I do use snares on occasion. And if you're going to use them, you need to know how to use them, and you need to use them responsibly. This isn't something that you're going to set up in a neighborhood. None of these are. If you're trying to trap, you're just getting into trapping, and you live in a subdivision or something. That's a recipe for disaster. It doesn't matter what you're using. It's just like hunting in a subdivision. It's just not a good idea. So you need to be in a place where you can legally do it, and sometimes you can legally do it in that subdivision, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it.
Absolutely, it gets into that moral gray area of ground pounding, game birds and things like that. Just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it.
Right, and especially with trapping, because you aren't there all the time. You don't necessarily know what all is going to happen in between when you left your trap and when you came back and checked your trap. You need to be very conscious of where you set them, and you need to be very conscious of setting them legally and responsibly. First of all, legally, you need to be in a place where you legally can do it and follow all the laws. But then, even beyond that, when it is legal, but you recognize it's not necessarily a great idea, that's a good chance to just pass that location up or use a different technique or a different tool. So in a place where I might not want to use a snare, I might be totally comfortable using a foothold, or vice versa. It just depends. So
let's talk about, we've only got a couple minutes left here, that I want to talk about the conservation side of it. Hunting is conservation, fishing is conservation, and I feel like trapping is left out of that conversation oftentimes. But trapping is conservation. What are you doing when you're targeting those animals?
Well, anytime you're not taking animals that there's we're not talking about endangered species here. We're talking about species that are very prolific, species that are abundant, species that are that there are definitely healthy populations of. Trapping, neither trapping nor hunting, legal hunting, regulated hunting, or legal or regulated trapping have resulted in the extinction or extermination of any species of fur bear.
Quite the opposite. Usually you're able to expand the range of that animal because that money from hunting, fishing related activities goes back to habitat.
And sometimes it will go back to habitat, but sometimes trapping has been used for the restoration of a variety of species. You look at river otter in New Mexico. Those river otter were caught using foothold traps, and they were brought back to New Mexico, and they were released and reintroduced into the state. That's a species that we wouldn't have here had it not been for the use of foothold traps. The same can be said of the Mexican gray wolf. Foothold traps is how they caught all of the seven originating, or the seven original wolves that all of the wolves that are left today come from, and they still use in that program. They still use the foothold trap when they're trying to catch a wolf, so that they can radio collar it, or so that they can take samples from it, or for whatever reason, it's one of their techniques to use. And the reason for that is because it's an efficient and it's an effective and it is a humane method of catching those animals. You wouldn't use that if it was going to be harmful to the animal. And it's all in how you use them. It's like anything; it can be abused. But if you're using it the way that you're supposed to, the way that it's designed, you shouldn't be hurting those animals. Trapping is a huge benefit to a variety of other species. You look at a lot of our birds, our ground nesting birds. If we didn't have trapping to help regulate a little bit of the predator population, whether it's skunks or raccoons or fox or even coyotes, we may have a real problem with some of our ground nesting bird populations. And you look at some of these states where a lot of waterfowl nesting happens. Skunks and raccoons are a huge predator on those nests. So trapping can help with that. It can also help just keep that population from completely getting out of hand. At some point, nature would control itself. Nature would reduce that population, but
those are often violent.
They're huge
boom
swings.
And bust type of swing.
Right, they're huge swings. So you don't want. We're trying to avoid those huge swings where we get a huge population and then no population because they've all died off. We want to kind of stay in that middle ground. And trapping regulated trapping, licensed trapping in the state of New Mexico and everywhere that that it exists currently, is it pays. Obviously everyone's got to have a license. They've got to have all their stamps. They've got to have all of that stuff. They've got to follow all of these laws. It pays for wildlife conservation, and it's a benefit to all of those species.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Ty. Really appreciate your knowledge and stuff. Want to do another one of these. Guys, follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and we'll have some YouTube videos as well. Again, thanks, Ty. Appreciate it.
You bet.